Welcome to the Grid Podcast, episode 17. Our guest is Glenn Rhoades, and we're here to help educate and to bring hard-hitting truths about America's critical infrastructure. I'm your host, Maria Sumnicht, and a disclaimer, public opinions expressed in the podcast by participants are their opinion and not necessarily that of the Grid Podcast. Please hit the subscribe and notification bell so you can be notified when we go live. Please like the video as it helps promote the channel on YouTube. Well, welcome back, Glenn. Glenn is the Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, Part 2. And he's going to continue with his experience and expertise on the grid and much more. So take it away, Glenn.
Okay. Well, thanks, Maria. I hope everybody can hear me. But as you know, I ended the first podcast with up to something that happened at Eureka moment. So I'm going to start with that. I am going to cover just a few more things. So as you can see, I've got a little intro slide here. I have a degree in architecture, sustainable habitat, from University of Colorado, and then I picked up an MBA in alternative transportation methods. Spent 16 years at Martin Marietta, Lockheed Martin, and 15 years at Home Depot, Best Buy, and Lowe's. So I'm also the founder of the Colorado Nanotechnology Initiative, which is part of the National Science Foundation. And I was listening to the first podcast, and I thought, there's a little bit of a disconnect on the chronology. So I thought I'd go over that real quick. Again, I got my Bachelor of Environmental Design, which is that architectural degree from CU. Then I spent 78 to 79 working at Martin Marietta, Astronautics down in Waterton Canyon near Denver. I left there, as you recall. My mother was quite annoyed and appalled that I would leave to go to work in Europe after I had a nice job. But I came back from Europe, and as I mentioned in that first podcast, I met my old boss at a Burger King, and he said, "Hey, but would you like your old job back since you're back from Europe?" And I go, "Yeah, I'll take it." So I worked until 1999 and picked up an MBA during that time from 91 to 93. Went to be a project manager at 3 Fortune 100 companies, and then became a task force state director, and then finally a state or a task force corporate officer after that. I wanted to mention this and put this for the sake of posterity. There are four people that really influenced my my worldview in a lot of ways. One was Jeremy Rifkin, who wrote Entropy: A New World Order in 1990 or 1980. The reason I mention that is because Jeremy Rifkin makes a really interesting argument. He's the director and founder of the Foundation on American Economic Trends, I believe, or maybe something like that. But it's in Washington, D.C. But he always talked about how entropy is interesting as a physical law, but it also applies to societal things in his perspective. And that worldview basically says that we're headed for more chaos and more higher states of entropy, even as a social structure. So it makes what we're trying to do here with the grid a lot more understandable, I think, if you have it under that context. And then, of course, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who wrote The Power and the Light. And Peter said that if anybody has one book that they can read that will surmise everything that we do, it would be The Power and the Light in 2020. I was also influenced by two very strong Christian men. One is Dr. Clyde Kilby, who wrote 10 Resolutions of Mental Health in 1976, and that's where I met Clyde Kilby. Really, really good. Talks about how we should view our universe and the wonders therein, okay? And also Dr. Francis Schaeffer, who wrote A Christian View of Ecology, which basically talks about why we mess things up on a daily basis. So again, we're an IRS, a 501c certified organization endorsed by the EMP Congressional Caucus to advise, seek expert opinions, technical, operational policy matters relevant to EMP and all threat vectors. And our founder was the former Chief of Staff of the U.S. EMP Commission. That's Dr. Peter Pry. So we have about 70 task force national, state, and field directors. We really are not trying to build a big organization. We want to be lean and mean. We'd like to have possibly maybe as little as 50 or maybe less, maybe 35 people that are really committed to finding solutions to these ominous things that are before us. I want to start by saying we are at war. If nobody understands that, they should. And since we're on a war footing that we don't really, a lot of us don't realize it, let's not feed the enemy. I've talked to my staff many a times to say there are certain things that we should basically keep from the enemy. In other words, my top fruit would be take down the Energy Information Administration's presence and probably other sites from the World Wide Web, because it should be a need-to-know accessible source. The reason why is because the power grid was never constructed to be a weapon of war. It was constructed to have free access and open, in an open environment. That would be okay, but we're not there anymore. With the continued rise of asymmetrical warfare, it keeps the grid in a very vulnerable position. When we had a debrief, Maria and I had a debrief from a federal official here. One of the things that he was really concerned about was drones and AI, artificial intelligence. And I couldn't help but think of two books that I read. One was by Eric Drexler called Engines of Creation, that talks about the whole nanotechnology stuff that's coming in, and marry that with AI, and you've got a real bad recipe for creating a lot of bad things. And the other one was Michael Creighton's The Swarm, which is really a scary book on nano drones. So our mission is to protect, obviously, critical infrastructures to assure national security, and our vision is to establish and secure a nation where all the infrastructures are safeguarded. We are a 501c3 organization, and like I said, we were founded by Dr. Peter Pry in 2014. I call it TOFANA's, Task Force on National and Homeland Security. As you know, we advocate and educate and initiate resiliency projects. I kind of look at it as kind of like a big giant jellyfish. We have tentacles that come down, and at the end of these tentacles are private companies, for example, governmental agencies, communities, legislators, and those are all part of what we're trying to do in terms of support and education. My eureka moment with this whole thing, and that's why I ended with 1999 when I left, or I should say with 2010, was in 2011 of March. I was 56 years old, and this eureka moment happened, like I said, 15 years ago, and it's one of the greatest missions of my life. What happened on March 11, 2011, was the Tōhoku Oki fault rupture. That's approximately 300 miles of earth that shifted on the Pacific Basin, approximately 150 feet high, killing 28,000, or I should say killing 28,000 not Americans, but Japanese. And it also left about 450,000 homeless. So the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which is on the coast, was affected in a very dramatic way. It basically lost line. And me, being kind of a little bit of a nerd, I knew that at the time, that there were 94 pressure and boiling water reactors in 55 different sites in 28 different states across the United States. I also knew that there were approximately 120 million Americans who live within 50 miles of one of these nuclear power plants. So when I read the article about the Fukushima Daiichi power plant becoming compromised, I started losing sleep, Maria. I couldn't go to bed. I was tossing and turning, and I going, what is it about this thing? It's really bothering me. For one thing, Maria, I ask myself, uh, duh, doesn't a nuclear power plant create its own electricity? That's what I said right away. It's like, how is it dependent on the bulk power system? I just can't figure it out. So finally, my wife Karen said, "Glenn, you got to get a life. You got to figure this out because this is not good." So I started doing an internet search, and it led me to this gentleman right here, Dr. Dan Baker, physicist and world expert on sun. And he was a NASA consultant, and he was at my alma mater, University of Colorado's Laboratory in Atmospheric and Space Physics at CU, not realizing this guy is like the prima donna of space weather experts. I call him out of the blue and I said, Dr. Baker, I am just an ordinary citizen here in Lakewood, Colorado. And I was wondering, do you have time to talk to me about what's keeping me awake at night? I can't figure it out. And Dr. Baker was very gracious, and he said, Glenn, come on up. I'll spend some time with you. So he gave me an afternoon. So I went up, and this is what he said. He said, Glenn, whoops, I'm going the wrong direction here. Oh, he said, Glenn, the reason you were concerned about this is very logical, and it's what a lot of people don't realize. The nuclear power plants, for the most part, the boiling and the pressure water reactors, and that's signified by a BWR as a boiling water reactor, a PWR is pressure water reactor. And the only difference, generally speaking, about the two is a boiling water reactor actually uses contaminated radioactive fuel to turn the turbines, okay, and to create power. The boiling water reactor has it's separated, so you don't use nuclear contaminated water uh, for turning the turbines. But here's where it really becomes interesting. When he explained this to me, he said, "Glenn, the water pumps that are used to push the water through the containment vessels on a nuclear reactor that turns into turbine are basically supplied by the bulk power system. And if the bulk power system goes down, then we have compromises in the stability of the pressure and boiling water reactors. I did not know that, and that's where the disconnect came in, because the earthquake had basically destroyed very critical high tension lines that were feeding the water pumps uh, to the nuclear power plant. So when that happens, you have to have backup generators to basically stabilize the whole thing. Let me go back to that slide again. So it's very important to know here that the backup generators only last for a certain period of time. They can be stabilized if you have enough fuel for possibly anywhere from 30 to 40 days, from what my nuclear experts tell me. But the most important thing are the spent fuel rods that are stored on site for when a power rod becomes um, spent enough so that it has to be cooled. It goes on site to a cooling bin, and it stays in there anywhere from 3 to 5 to 10 years. And that has to be indefinitely cooled before it's dry cast and then moved out of that area. Now, it would make sense that we would move that stuff out right away, but a lot of it becomes a political hot potato. A lot of people don't like spent fuel rods going through their community. And I mean, if I was in a position of power, I would say, forget that. I don't care what your political opinions are. We need to get them away from U.S. American cities. So my first thought would be to get those out of harm's way and keep them away from the 120 million Americans um, that could potentially be affected by an evaporation of those spent fuel rod pools. Okay. Now, interesting enough, I talked to Dr. William Graham, who's the chairman of the EMP Congressional Commission, about 3 weeks ago. And I asked him, I said, Dr. Graham, he lives in California. He said, Dr. Graham, you've been doing this a long time. What do you feel are still your major concerns in terms of the power grid? And Maria, you know what he told me?
No.
He said the spent fuel rods. He said we have to make sure those are indefinitely cooled. And if those burn up and there's a nuclear fire, we're in bad shape. So that's from the former EMP commissioner that told that to me on the phone. So that's still a major concern, right? The other thing Dr. Dan Baker told me is, Glenn, imagine that the earth is the size of a mustard seed and you put it on the 1 yard or on the goal line. And then you took the size of a soccer ball, a yellow soccer ball, and you put it on the 31-yard line. Okay, at 31 yards, that's basically 93 feet. So in this little illustration, 1 foot is equal to 1,000,000 miles. Okay, so you've got that kind of perspective. So every once in a while, the sun will, and Dr. Daniel Baker is explaining this. Every once in a while, you have a big giant magnetic, he calls that a magnetic flux rope, which I'll show you in a second. So you can see from this illustration that there's a little tiny dot, that's the Earth, and then there's this big giant hunk of magnetized plasma. And Dr. Baker said, Glenn, sometimes that magnetized plasma comes off the sun and goes hurtling across space. We call it a magnetic flux rope. It's got polarity on it, north and south polarity. And we don't know what the polarity is when it's going to hit the Earth after traveling 93 million miles, right? So that's a concern, because I'll tell you in a second why that's a concern. And he said, I'm the one that did the paper on the 2012 superstorm that missed the Earth by 9 days. Okay, now this is a model of where the Earth is. As you can see, that little dot there is the Earth, and then we have the stereo A and the stereo B satellites. These are satellites that actually revolve around the sun with the Earth at the same generally the same position. And what happened on July 12th, this superstorm, it had a big giant glob of plasma that did one sweep across the solar system, and it cannibalized another CME, and it basically struck that stereo A satellite with all the force that would have struck the Earth had it been 9 days earlier. Now, what that means is the stereo A satellite collected the data from that superstorm, and it was worse than the Carrington event. And had we been 9 days earlier in our orbit, Maria, you and I would not be talking here today. We wouldn't be here.
Nope.
We
No,
would have had lost all our 2,000, the critical 2,400 or 600 transformers, those big giant things. And we'd still be picking up the pieces. And it wouldn't only be the United States, it'd be the whole planet. So we dodged a big bullet there. Did you have any questions about that?
no. I was there. I mean, I was there when that happened. What, like
Yeah.
2 years ago? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of an interesting little model there. But there's more bad news. Okay, so he's going and explaining all this stuff, and by the way, just to get back on this stereo satellite thing, there is actually a satellite that is 1,000,000 miles closer to the sun than our Earth. Okay, so if you go back to this picture right here, where we are, if you have the mustard seed is the goal line. If you went out 1 foot closer to that soccer ball, okay, at 1,000,000 miles there, that is when that magnetized plasma hits that satellite at Lagrange point 1. It's called the SOHO satellite. That is where we know what the polarity is of that CME. Now, what that means is that it broadcasts the polarity back to us. And so if it's got the same polarity as the Earth, generally speaking, it will be like two magnets. They're the same polarity. It's kind of glance off each other. But if it's switched, if the polarity is opposite from what the Earth is with the CME, it'll couple with it and it'll draw that current in. And as Peter Pry often mentioned to me, it says, Glenn, it's like starting a lawnmower. Physics 101 says the movement of two magnetic fields will cause an inductive current. And so when you pull that lawnmower cord, you're actually creating two magnetic fields that interact with each other. It creates a spark to get your spark plug going. Well, that's what happens with the Earth. The Earth has a core, it has a magnetosphere, and the wobbling of that magnetosphere based on this coronal mass ejection hitting it caused ground-induced currents, and that's the bad news. That's what would have destroyed all our 2,000 plus transformers. So just a little background on that. The other bad news, he said, is, Glenn, we had a series of tests that were done by the Atomic Energy Commission in July 9th of 1962. It's called Operation Fishbowl. And they had a number of tests. One was bluefish or bluegill or whatever. They had a number of tests at different altitudes. The reason they did this is because we were just in our infancy stage of learning how nuclear weapons affect everything. We didn't really know. We're trying to figure out what had happened. And we did have some indication that there was some sort of nuclear electronic interaction with a balloon that went off. It was called the Eureka experiment back in Hawaii. But we wanted to know more about it. So we popped off this 1.4 megaton thermonuclear bomb at 250 miles above the Johnson Atoll. And that's basically 900 miles southeast of Honolulu, Hawaii. And it was overseen by the Defense Atomic Support, or actually I had the Atomic Energy Commission, and that on the Defense Atomic Support Agency, which is now morphed into DTRA, which is the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Okay, so what happened is when that thing went off, we knew about effects called the Compton effect, and that is when a nuclear bomb goes off, it creates a blast. Okay, a blast of physical kinetic force. Okay, but it also creates a gamma ray thing that comes off that pulse. And what they found out is the gamma rays knocked off electrons from upper atmospheric gases. Okay, so we kind of knew that a little bit, but there was a guy named Longmire, Conrad Longmire at Los Alamos Labs, and he was the one that basically said, there's something else that's happening, and I think I know what it is. So we knew about the Compton effect, the molecules being split off the atoms, but he's the one that gave us synchrotron radiation. Okay, now what synchrotron radiation is that when you split a molecule off an atom, it becomes ionizing. It starts finding a place to latch onto. But what Conrad Longmire said is that because the Earth's gravity is pulling these electrons that are now free scattering towards the Earth, it's creating a magnet, and it's creating a magnet that pushes them toward the Earth. And as they push towards the Earth, magnetically, they start spinning along the Earth's geomagnetic lines. Nobody had ever thought about that before. And Conrad Longmire is the one that said it creates a super EMP radio wave, because when you have these little electrons that are spinning, billions of them, it creates a radio flash. So that's what happened, and that's what created an anomaly that caused streetlights in Honolulu, Hawaii to flicker. There were some other anomalies that happened, and so that was that. The other thing that happens is a shrimp, which is a source region EMP. I was doing a presentation one day in Golden, and an Associated Press reporter came up to me and said, Glenn, I was there at Nagasaki interviewing people after the bomb went off, and this was a ground burst, okay? And he said, do you know what somebody told me? And I said, what? He said, well, I talked to a radio operator who was in a radio or a telephone switching station about 5 or 6 miles from the blast, and she was on break at the time, but she told me that her comrades who were on the board doing connections for the telecom, they were all electrocuted. And I said, really? And I told Peter Pry that, and he said, well, that's impossible. That doesn't make any sense. But I told that to another uh, uh, weapons expert, and he said, Glenn, they were killed by a shrimp. And I go, what is a shrimp? He said, any copper wire that touches the fireball of a land-based, a terrestrial-based bomb, like it doesn't have to be in outer space. It could just be, well, these are like they were exploded a little bit higher off the surface of the Earth. But any fireball that any copper line that touches that will induce a current. And that's what electrocuted these people. So that was kind of an interesting thing. That was from an Associated Press reporter. The other thing we talked about, obviously, is the Carrington event, where Richard Carrington was the first one to observe that even when you have a flash, normally you have a coronal mass ejection coming off of that. But we found recently that coronal mass ejections can actually happen without a solar flare flash, which is kind of interesting. That's never they're still trying to study how that's possible. But these solar flashes are going on. Solar flashes and CMEs, micro CMEs, are happening all the time, and it's really interesting to make sure that you understand the distinction between a solar flare and a CME. Okay, so the guys at the Space Weather Prediction Center that you met Sean Dahl, and you met Dr. Or you met Bill Murtaugh. They'll tell you that a solar flare is like the flash of a muzzle of a cannon way in a distance. And those protons get to us, and they have a little magnetic signature on them. They get to us in about 9 minutes, 8 to 9 minutes. Okay, so that's why Carrington, even though he saw the flash, he didn't understand until he went to an observatory across London, and he looked at at a seismic reading. It's kind of like a seismic reading, but it's for a magnetic pulse. He noted that at the same time he saw the flash, just 9 minutes later, there was a magnetic signature. Okay, so that magnetic signature is what we've experienced when we were at the Space Weather Prediction Center. My wife, you, and I, and Dr. Kenneth Skog, who's a IPCC climate scientist, and Ken DeGraff. That's what we experienced, because when that I think it was an 8.1 X flare went 90 degrees away from us, it still created those photon signatures that created a magnetic pulse. And basically, as you saw, you were right there. You saw the screen turn from like normal to like a blue to beet red, right? And at that point in time, the ding dong bell went off in the Space Weather Prediction Center. It said, a solar flare is now in progress, right?
It was like, Houston, we have a problem, is what happened.
Yeah. And what happened is Bill Murtaugh called Vandenberg to say, hey, scrub that launch. Why? Because that magnetic signature from the protons created such a disturbance in the ultra high frequency band that if they had launched that missile at Vandenberg at the same time that it was going to be launched, and we had that anomaly, they wouldn't have been able to self-destruct that missile. And that's really bad, because if you wouldn't have a control over it and it went haywire, you could end up killing people, right, in California somewhere. So that's why it's really, really interesting, right? So, and interestingly enough, this slide is wrong, because I heard this from some people that were CME experts, that the deployed telegraph systems and the transatlantic cable were destroyed, and that's not true. Actually, I have to modify this slide, because I just found out about this within the last 2 weeks. What happened is the transatlantic cable was laid in 1858 in August, and in 1858 in September, they tried to get it to go, and it was working a little bit, but a guy in England said it's taking too long for the telegraph signals to go off, and he inserted 2,000 volts of electricity on the England side to push it through, and he burned the cable. So in 1859, when the Carrington event happened, the cable was already dead. It wasn't functioning, and it didn't become functioning again until about 9 or 10 years later, when they relayed another one pick it up. So I got to change that slide. That's wrong. Then we have non-nuclear EMP devices, which I believe, and Peter Pry believes, is probably one of the lowest dangers that nobody ever talks about, and that's the fabrication of directed energy capacitors that can pop off between 3 and 500 kV per meter. Now, what that means is that, and we saw it. Dr. Richard Geyer, who's on the task force, and John Spence, who's on the task force, we had a special briefing at a defense contractor, and we saw this thing. Basically, Maria, this can charge, discharge, and recharge in nanoseconds up to 3 to 500 kilovolts per meter, which means that you would fry several football fields around where that detonated went off on the ground. You would just fry it. Now, we don't have a HEMP device or something that's floating in the upper atmosphere is not nearly as powerful as one of these things, but it means that you have to protect sources that could be close to a directed energy capacitor drone that could wipe out your stuff. Okay, that's the bottom line. It's not good. Okay, obviously we have physical attacks. Again, we had 107 that happened the first 8 months of 2022. They're continuing to be put off, be popped off. There's a lot of physical attacks that happen each and every day. I don't know if they're disgruntled people or anarchists or whatever, but there's a constant flow of those bad guys doing it. Or we could have a cyber and malware attack. Either an embedded virus or something that's already in a control system, or a SCADA device or a relay or a router, whatever. And you know so much about this, Maria, because you're working New York City. You speculated that some of this stuff that could have caused some of the navigation problems with that ship that ran into the Bay Bridge could have been affected by a crane that was made by China. I mean, that's a real possibility.
Yeah, that was in Baltimore, but yeah, the
Yeah.
Scott Key Bridge. Yeah,
Yeah. And then we also have natural and weather-related events like the 2011-2021 polar vortex, right? And our board chair, David Hilt, was the one that did the classified reports for the 2011 polar vortex, and he also did the 2013 report for the Metcalf incident that was overshadowed by the Boston bombing. And Peter Pry always speculated that the Boston bombing could have been a diversion to keep us from looking at what had actually happened with that Metcalf incident. So those are all possibly interrelated. We're not sure about that. And then it's also noteworthy that natural related events could include animals. Animals take down the power grid all the time. In Japan, in 2019, more than 12,000 people were stuck on Kyushu Island in Japan, because what happened is it just brought down the power grid. So they looked and did forensic analysis, and it traced it back to one control panel. There's one control box. And so before they cracked that thing open, they videotaped the outside of this thing. And Maria, it looked perfect. There was nothing wrong with it. But when they popped it open, there was this big giant slug that had shorted out the panel. And it caused 30 trains to come to a grinding halt.
wow.
So when they looked back on that videotape that looked pretty pristine, they saw a small crack in the thing, in where the caulking was. And I have a video that was given to me by Randy White, who's a defense contractor. And I don't know how they got the slug to do it, but the ballpoint pen cartridges, they're real tiny.
Yeah.
I have a video of, I don't know if they laced the inside of this cartridge with food, but you could see this big giant slug going right through the middle of a ballpoint pen.
Yeah, so they just
So,
thin themselves. That's, yeah. Oh,
isn't that crazy?
yeah.
That's it's great. Okay. So we also have external threats from other things that might influence the grid, because as you know, the grid has got to be balanced through voltages, frequency, and phasing. And Dr. George Baker brought this up a number of years ago. And also NREL here in Denver had also started looking at that. You have directed current that's coming in from the sun, and it has to be transformed to AC current so that it can be fed into the larger grid, right? But what's really interesting is not only George Baker said that the parasitic attachments of microgrids, like my microgrid feeding into the bulk power system, there's a couple of ways that could be bad news, and that is if the parasitic attachment of my microgrid is infected by a malware, it could infect the whole system through your smart grid system. Or you could have a phenomenon called grid forming inverters. And that is if you have a bunch of inverters that are trying to pump in alternating current into from the direct current that's feeding into it, you could have an imbalance that could bring down your whole grid. Now, that basically was what happened in the Iberian Peninsula when the Portugal and the Spanish grid went down, because you have to have the grid always balanced, like in the frequency, voltage, and phasing. It's like a hot air balloon, and if you have any anomaly in your let's say your microgrids, whether they be wind, solar, or other things, if you have a, a glitch, for example, let's say a guy's tooling around in a semi truck and inadvertently takes out, or maybe they're caused by just life of end of life cycle. But let's say he takes out 4 or 5 inverters on the Spanish grid. Well, that wouldn't be a problem if you have the base load that you can bring up to rebalance the grid. But in that particular case, when they had some grid of inverters fail, there wasn't the base load because they didn't have enough base load from France, which was supplying them with nuclear energy. Some of the base load was offline there, and not only that, they didn't have some other supplying base loads from their coal fire and natural gas and liquid gas plants to bring up and balance and rebalance the load for the whole grid to keep maintain its integrity. And so what happened, embarrassingly enough, is Spain's and the Iberian Peninsula is bragging about how they've got the whole thing is based on, solar panels and wind, and they had a failure of some inverters, and they weren't able to bring the base load up. And what happens? The whole country went without power for 8 hours or more. The whole country. Now, that's not good. So those can happen. And then the last thing, well, second to last thing is human follies or mistakes. Remember I was telling you about, we went to a defense contractor and he showed us that capacitor, high
Yeah.
energy capacitor. Well, I immediately thought, well, that's not good, because if you're saying that the plans can be taken offline to build these things, that's not good. But I said, the probably the most probable person or people that would influence and use these things are not a nation state. It would probably be some bank robber that's trying to get into take down all the electronic cyber equipment to maintain integrity, keep our cash safe, or some other things, some other type of precious metals or whatever it is. And that has actually happened in Europe a couple of times, according to the feds. They've told us that. So they don't like to tell that to very many people, because that's a factor that has to be included in not only maintaining operations, but with the rise of AI systems. The task force is committed to, anywhere we talk about AI systems, anything that's related to AI systems that support military operations or life-sustaining infrastructure has got to be protected from any of these high voltage capacitors or even anomalies from the sun. It's just a basic thing that nobody's really looking at really seriously. And then the last thing, which is really scary, is um, what we call the balloon effect. Okay, the balloon threat report, as you know, that balloon floated across the whole entire United States at one point in time in the
Yep.
past, and that's really bad because theoretically launch a balloon. Uh, these balloons carry up to 4 tons of payload. Now, a yield of a 1.2 megaton thermonuclear or nuclear bomb doesn't weigh nearly that much. But theoretically, you could launch that anywhere clandestinely, and it would to get to an effective altitude in probably less than 30 minutes. You do it at night and you'd launch it. Now, it wouldn't take out the whole entire United States, but it could take out significant portions of the US power grid. And I think that the task force has always been committed, based on this information, to say we need to look at readdressing our international boundaries in terms of airspace for unvetted and unsecured balloons, especially those that come from China or North Korea. If you're
Mhm.
tracking these, they need to be brought down at least 1,000 miles, okay? Maybe 5 to 1,000 miles away from our shores. If you get in closer to that, at 500 miles away, you could take down the Western power grid or the Eastern power grid. So
Yep.
you wouldn't allow that to happen. There's no way you would allow it. Not with the new technologies that are coming out. There's no way. One of the we have is, this is my famous slide. We have too many cooks in the kitchen. We have so many organizations. Last time I counted, we have 40 organizations that are all telling us about all the stuff that's going to go south that could really harm us in our electrical power grid. But they're preaching these things, and it's like all those cooks are creating different recipes. They're not creating the same recipe, and they're all creating these things, and nobody's talking to each other. That's not good. We
Yeah.
need to figure out how to consolidate operations. The other thing is the tyranny of the urgent. Okay, I was brought up and not brought up, but I was educated to understand Maslow's basic human needs pyramid. Okay, as an architect, we have to understand this human needs chart. Okay, the tyranny of the urgent means that there are things that are being very highly uh, encouraged that really are low. They really shouldn't be. They shouldn't be looked at. I guess they should be looked at, but there's too much focus on the tyranny of the urgent. For example, AI and some other things that are really taking the limelight. According to Sun Tzu's Art of War, the number one weapon against an adversary is to get him to be distracted or deceived. It really doesn't matter much. The AI race is one thing. I think that instead of doing the AI race and doing the Golden Dome, in my perspective, let's figure out how to make sure that we have ability to keep our population fed, that we have water, food, purification, all those physical needs down at the bottom physiological levels. We need to focus in on that. That's a
Absolutely.
there's lack of attention for that.
Hmm.
And my brother-in-law, Dr. Ken Skog, who's on the IPCC, I said, "Listen, Ken, I know that you're a big climate change activist and trying to mitigate that, but I asked Ken. I said, Ken, in your worst case scenario, what would happen if we don't address the climate change issue right away?" Okay, so he told me, "Glenn, we might have to. I mean, there's going to be other things that are going to happen, but we may have to move 500 million people away from the coastlines, and that's really bad." And I go, "Well, okay, I see that. I mean, let's assume that's correct. But when you're not dealing with what we're talking about, how would you weigh that with what we're talking about here?" And that is, let me come back to that. The idea that we have 2 out of 3 human beings will live in big mega cities that will be infected if we hit a coronal mass ejection and they take down our transformers or a HEMP, they will be dying within a year. I mean, let's face it, we have to set our priorities right, right? So I think we're distracted there. The other thing is what I call, why hasn't anything happened yet? And this kind of towards the end of the podcast here, but I call this America's 250th birthday celebration burger. It's called the Cassandra burger. Okay. Now, here's why. Here's the funny thing about it. I was doing a presentation in Rangeley, Colorado, and this guy came up, and he's really a nice guy. He's kind of a hippie philosopher, you know, and he was really interesting to talk to. He's really smart. He said, Glenn, you've got the Cassandra problem. And I go, well, what is that? He goes, do you know anything about Greek mythology? And I go, no, I haven't read it. And I think I've read maybe a little bit, but I don't know anything about it. He said, well, here's the thing. So in Greek mythology, I guess Apollo had the hots for Cassandra. Okay, she was another lesser god. And so he thought that if he gave her special powers, that she would be ingratiated to him and they would develop a relationship, right? So that's what he did. He gave her the power to foresee the future, both good and bad, right? And then after that, she got a cold shoulder and she didn't like him anymore. Okay, according to this guy. And like I said, I may be butchering this story up, but it's taken from the source, right?
Yeah.
He said, but could do is he could add on to the power. And I said, okay, what did he add on? He goes, the ability or the power that he added on was that nobody would believe her. Okay.
Very good.
So, so, so from Greek mythology, we have a Cassandra burger. We are talking about things that go bump in the night that could
Yeah.
kill us, destroy us, but nobody believes us. Nobody believes us. And the other thing is we have solutions that are in the burger. The problem is we've got two titanium buns that are painted brown like a real hamburger bun. One is the legal and regulatory issues at the top, and the bottom bun is a normalcy bias. And unless we get those out of the way, we won't be able to solve the problem. Okay? That means that we have to have enlightened leadership. Now, I give a little chart of the electromagnetic spectrum chart. It's kind of interesting. Up the left, upper left-hand corner is the ability to process and create energy, and then the bottom half is HEMPs and X-rays and a lot of different stuff like that. And we know that all of it has to do with water too. So we'll get back to the solution there in a second. But I wanted to tell you that another thing that really comes up to the surface here is in 1882 there was a glass ceiling limiting human beings to about 40 and 45 years. Why? And I asked you this before, Maria, and it's because Nikola Tesla basically created with Westinghouse and Edison created the alternating and direct current power. We were able to purify stuff, homogenize stuff, sanitize stuff. It broke through medicines, and finally we were able to do it. We were able to keep human beings alive for another 30, maybe 40 years, right? So how are we doing? We're not doing so good, okay? Because first of all, we have to conclude these two things, rationally speaking. We have a current thinking of MAD, mutual assured destruction. So this is why a lot of electrical power companies are really saying, I don't need to deal with this, because mutual assured destruction would happen with an all-out nuclear exchange. We would all be crispy critters really quickly. And within a half hour, we'd lose millions and millions of people. But the other thing they don't want to deal with is a super EMP weapon, whether it's satellite, low orbiting satellite, or a nuclear balloon. Okay, so as soon as you bring those two up, they don't want to do anything. The problem is you have to change your philosophy to SANE, what Peter Pry dubbed strategic assured national existence. That is, we can do some things that might mitigate an overall catastrophic failure of our society. Okay, if we can keep 4 or 5 million people, maybe we have some collateral damage with a lot of people dying. That's what would happen. But if we can keep our the majority of our people alive, that's something to be realistically looked at. So we think that islanding or fracturing in some circumstances the U.S. power grid is a rational approach. We also think that applying technologies and procedures to assure critical components are protected from all hazards threat protection. That's also a low-hanging fruit. And then there's other things that we can do, which I don't want to, I hesitate to identify right now, but there are some other things that we can do to keep us alive. Okay. The one thing that we don't want to do is say what right now what the power companies are saying is if we get hit by a coronal mass ejection, they're just going to de-energize the grid, which is not going to work. I mean, the people that we know say it's going to be disastrous. If we have to re-energize the grid, it may not work. It may not turn back on. And the other thing is communications are so important, Maria. Right now, the ability to power up your power grid is all dependent on solar or cell phones. And right now, our grid people, you've heard them say that there are a number of different ways that different people do it differently. But if your cell phone towers are gone, you're not going to be able to.
Nope.
You're not going to be able to have that done. And then obviously mitigate the GIC events, the ground-induced current from solar storm, and there's some technologies out there which could give us a chance for survival. So here in Colorado, I'll end with this because we're almost at the end of the hour here. When I first heard about this, I called up the Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities program, and I said, if anybody would know, they would know. Let's talk to them. And they couldn't give us the time of day. They go, we don't deal with that. I go, this is the number one thing that could destroy our mega cities across the planet. We're not interested. Okay. So I couldn't figure that out at all. I mean, they just don't apply science and technology to the threat vectors that could take down American city. So I started talking around, and Dr. Baker told me to talk to three people. One was John Dara, who lives at the Broadmoor down in Colorado Springs. He's very good friends with Hank Cooper and with Dr. William Graham. In fact, Dr. Peter Pry, when he was working as the chief of staff of Kurt Weldon's subcommittee for the House subcommittee on arms, I'd say I think it's the subcommittee on military arms. I can't even remember the subcommittee now. It escapes me right now. But anyway, Peter Pry was given the task of hiring the top physicists to do this. So I called up Peter. He said, you need to get in touch with this. You need to read Power and The Power and the Light. And I can help you help the nation to get started with this. And I said, well, how many people do you have working for you? And he said, well, just me and Cynthia Ayers. Tom Popick had been working with him before too, previously. And then he told me and then Dr. Baker told me to talk to Bill Murtaugh at the Space Weather Prediction Center. And so that's how kind of I got started. So I went on Coast to Coast AM with George Nuri back in 2014, and a state representative from Colorado said, I'd like to sponsor a bill. So it was House Bill 1363, and I brought in all the the experts in to testify for this bill. We brought in Chuck Manto, George Baker, Tom Popick, John Kappeman, Peter Pry. I think Frank Gaffney was here for a short time, and other people, right? And also Andrea Bolin, who was a representative from New Hampshire. She was here too. We brought in all these people, and it failed. And the reason it failed is because the power companies have that normalcy bias that, this thing is a once in a lifetime thing. It's not really that important. But again, if you do the threat risk analysis, we can't afford to have the grid to go down, Maria. It will be too late. We have to be proactive in doing this, right?
Yep.
Then there was another bill that we tried to introduce in House Bill 22-1404. That was placed on indefinite hold. And And that bill, I was on a radio station with a gal named Kim Munson, and she said, Glenn, you got this task force going on. Did you see what Excel Energy wanted to do with this bill? And I go, what's it about? She goes, it's about protecting the power grid by introducing this thing, whatever it is, to keep the power grid from going down. And I go, okay, well, I haven't read it. She said, well, we're going to go to commercial break. Why don't you read it right now? And I read it, and Maria, it didn't say anything. She said, what do you think about it? And I go, well, yeah, I guess it's okay. I guess there's some things in here okay, but it just seems like the utilities, bless their heart, they got all these bills on the runway, and anything a hiccup goes on, an anomaly goes on, they launch another bill, but it really doesn't get to the heart of the problem.
No.
And so what they were trying to do with this bill is create a Colorado. It was called the SETA, Colorado Energy Transmission Authority, which is kind of good. I mean, in some respects, it's again trying to get fracturing of the grid, that islanding mode, but it's not quite there. And so I testified to that, and I said, yeah, you know, it might be good, but there's some things in here that are missing, and that is you need to make sure that there's hardened components here that you're able to black start the power grid. And one of the things that John Kappelman said that's really critical is we have coal-fired power plants that are a backbone, that we can always indefinitely rely on those. But those power plants will be reduced to 2 stories of smoldering rubble if we do not protect the systems that keep the boiler in balance. And that's the one takeaway I got. So there's some SCADA devices and some sensors and other things that we need to do immediately. It's a low-hanging fruit. Keep those coal-fired power plants before we make a transition to other more hardened energy sources of a generation. And nobody's doing that, but we should. That would be really, really good for America. So let's do that right off the bat, right? And they would be protected, hopefully, from drones too, taking out our coal-fired power plants. We do not want those boilers to go south and to be destroyed. And so, again, we're trying to do it from the bottoms up and the top down. And people should read the congressional reports of 4, 6, 8, and 17. We're still in our infancy stage about how do we protect, the power grid, especially from extreme solar storms. And there's some ideas there that we have. And I'm going to end it with basically, I think this. That's just my contact information. And if anybody wants to talk to me, they can talk to me anytime, or they can write me an email, and I will send them 3 books that are really critical for understanding this on another level. One is an electronic version of Peter Pry's The Power and the Light. He gave me permission to send that to you, to anybody that wants it. And the other one is John Hollerman's Grid Down, Death of a Nation, which is an excellent expose of what we have to worry about if the grid goes down. John Hollerman's book hopefully will never come to fruition because it talks about reconstituting the grid or a culture after the events has happened. That's a non-starter. We have to protect it before it happens. And then the last would be a report called non-nuclear EMP, and it's something that the FBI has told us are very big concerns. That's drones and AI attacks. Non-nuclear EMP is what Peter Price said, that you would have thousands of drones with capacitors on there that would just take out systems. That's not good. So that's it.
Yeah. No, thank you. What an excellent presentation. Thank you. And let me switch screens here.
Okay.
For
Can you see me?
those, yeah, I can see you. So for those of folks who think that drone attacks is, something in the in the future, actually, February 14th, 2025, an unidentified drone, meaning unidentified from a country, a nation state, crashed into Chernobyl. So, with all the conflict going on there, you can Google it. So, drone warfare at that level against power plants is already happening. So,
Yeah.
that's a concern. And, you know, Glenn touched on a couple of really great points, and I want to encourage people to go watch episode 15 of the Grid podcast with Don Marksberry, because he talks about nuclear reactor safety issues, and he talks
Yeah.
about spent fuel rods, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, you really need to go watch that. A great episode, just very educational. If you, whatever, he talks about everything regarding
Yeah.
nuclear energy that you don't want to know, but you need to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
And
and
Maria, that's really good because that's what Bill Graham said was highest on his priority out of all the things, you know. But I would say, Maria, you would probably agree with me too that we have to make sure our comms are done. Are done.
oh, yeah,
I spoke at the Colorado in 2016. I spoke to the, I don't know if you can see this. It's called
yeah,
the Colorado um, Public Safety Radio Summit,
hmm,
and the guys from Department of Commerce, FirstNet, were there, and I said, "Hey, is FirstNet protected against an EMP pulse?" And he goes, "No."
no,
I go, "Well, they should be."
they
He said,
should.
"Well, we had a chance to do that, but they're not." And
No,
KOA radio will be off the air too.
yep,
So we have to figure out one of our task force directors said, Glenn, probably the best and quickest way to do it cheaply is FM broadcasting system transmitters. Because everybody has a FM radio, and you
hmm,
can wrap it in aluminum foil, and you can continuously broadcast if everything else fails. Because ham operators, that's going to be point to point. It's not a mass distribution of
right.
public safety information. So anyway, that's
Right.
it.
The other, well, speaking of telcos and telecom, episode 10 uh, by Rick, we had telecom expert Rick Smith on, and he talked about connected at the hip, the electric grid and telecommunications. And you really
Oh,
need to know that most cell towers at best have 72, at best, 72 hours of backup power. And after that, if there's nothing,
oh,
we're
yeah.
down. Telco is down. Our cell phones are down. Things. So that's another. And the other one is episode 9 with David Moran, which is just demystifying nuclear, which he talks a lot about,
Yeah.
nuclear energy. And I think that those are some episodes, if you haven't seen, that you should see. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and to segue on that one comment, our territory advisor for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands is Lieutenant Colonel Izzy Romero, and
hmm,
he told me, he said, Glenn, after Hurricane Maria came, we started figuring out. Well, first of all, we had to clear the roads. So he was saying the Army is the first to respond because if you
yeah,
can't get from physically from point A to point B, you're hosed, right? So that was the very first thing. You have to have physical connectivity. Okay. Then after
yep,
that, they started putting cell phone towers on, but they started disappearing right after they put them on. And
mhm,
they figured these people were stealing them, the generators. So
yeah,
now
that
they
too.
woke up to say, no, we got to have armed guards to make sure that the generators keep that power for the cell phone towers.
Yep, yep, yeah, that's a whole other issue.
Yeah.
Protecting, yeah, and I can guarantee too, if the power goes out, where do you think people are going to find generators
Yeah.
and things like that? So that would be,
Yeah.
maybe that's down a whole nother rabbit hole. But I want to
Yeah.
thank you so
Well,
much. Is there?
okay.
Let's look at some
Questions?
questions in the chat. Yeah. So Lola Walsh asks, can RAP FM radio, will it work? I'm not sure what RAP FM radio is.
She means if you put it in a
Oh, okay.
Faraday cage, like
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay.
wrap it in aluminum foil and stuff. I would say I don't know how much aluminum foil you'd use, but I think GTP or Gemini would tell you how much to use because it's probably a very common question. But here's the thing: if you had an FM radio station, then we have to have our powers that be, like the Colorado Department of Public Safety and Homeland Security, they have to interject that thing into the system, because
Mm-hmm.
the public, the response to a grid down situation is not being addressed right now. The Colorado Public Safety Ops Plan will deal 99% with all the stuff that goes bump in the night, but we don't have a super annex. We should have a super annex that's
Mm-hmm.
created to Expo, which is extended power outage, and in that super annex, that's where you would say you're going to deploy very cheap and inexpensive FM broadcasting systems and the material that they're going to say. Because if you can't tell people where to go, you're not going to do it through a speaker going up and down the
Right.
road. You got to have that, and that's a
Yeah.
backup, and nobody's doing it. That's what we need. So yes, I think you could protect your FM radio broadcast or your FM receiver if you
Yeah.
wrap it up enough. Anybody else?
Uh, there was some comments by Richard Geyer, and it says time for solar particles from the sun to the earth, distance between the earth and the sun, 149.6 times 10. I don't know. Richard, he gets too technical for me. Anyway.
But he's the one that told me and educated me on the fact that photons have a magnetic signature. They have a
Yeah,
magnetic thing. So it's I didn't even know that. I thought it was just a proton of light. Like, no, it's got a magnetic signature. That's why Richard said I can go outside my door with a magnetometer
yeah.
and I can pulse the current standard that NERC has for protection from the sun at 4 volts per meter or per kilometer just in the front yard without anything happening. That's our protection. No,
Right,
it's got to be much, much higher than that.
right. And he says, yeah. So if something goes off, it travels 49.8 seconds. Could anyone
Yeah.
react in that short of time? And I wrote, I don't believe so, Richard. Yeah, there would be,
Yeah,
you know,
that's just too much. We
yeah,
have to, and we don't want to have
yeah,
AI be involved in the decision making to turn the grid off and on, for
oh yeah,
crying out loud.
yeah.
That's just
That's
nuts. We
that's
have to have some human intervention to
yes,
say, no, there's got to be a practical way.
right,
Getting that information to us quickly is important, but
yep,
the decision to do something after that
right.
can't be AI.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, actually, a really good podcast, and we had Dr. George Condos, and he talked about AI on the grid.
Yeah.
So that was episode. Let me look over here. Um, that was, I believe, episode 12. But just look it up with George. It was really good. I mean, he's one of our national AI experts.
Yeah.
He's been involved
Yeah.
with AI, since 1960s and 70s. So he was
Yeah. He
ground
is. He's
floor. He was on the,
really a good guy. Oh my gosh.
yeah.
Well, Maria, you and I talked about the fact that we don't do this because of money. I mean, nobody likes to give to a bad news
Right,
party.
right,
And
right.
and I had a guy come up to me and said he was one of the early task force members. He goes, Glenn, I remember there was a time when I used to be invited to parties. I go, really? He goes, yeah. They don't invite me to parties
Parties
anymore.
anymore.
And I ended up talking to them
I know.
about the most important thing that they could ever really try to solve, and that
Yeah,
is the electrical power grid. But
yeah.
with that, we don't look for money. But God bless him. If Elon Musk listens to this and says, "Hey, you
Mhm.
might want to give it to a good cause," we're always there, and we would
Right, right.
tell him so many vulnerabilities in outer space. Maria, I think we've gone full circle. I am really nervous about having our GPS signals based in outer space. I think we need to have terrestrial triangulation of anything that has to do with GPS. I really do,
Yep,
because
yep.
weaponized, and anything up there can be zapped by a Chinese laser platform or a small nuclear device. There's just too
Right.
much junk up. We need to start looking at down to earth stuff,
And
really.
and we do have laser weapons for people who believe that we don't. They're called directed
Yeah.
energy weapons. Go
Yeah.
look it
Yeah.
up. And
Yeah.
George Condos's episode is episode 13.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Glenn, I want to thank
Okay.
you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today live and who will watch it later. And
Yeah.
until next Wednesday, I want to say have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Thank you.